Tanking is one of the most classic MMO archetypes of gameplay that has not seen much of a place in Guild Wars 2. Over the years, lesser utilized playstyles have come into the fold, such as healing with the Heart of Thorns expansion, but tanking has never really found its niche. Funnily enough, the condition Taunt was added to the game back in Heart of Thorns, but it is, in my opinion, extremely limited in its potential under its current iteration, and could have been a key component in giving more consistency to raiding, strike mission, and fractal design. With new ways of healing coming in with Guild Wars 2 End of Dragons, modes of single target healing truly shine in a PvE environment when you understand which ally will be controlling the fight, and thus tanking the most damage. So, let me take you deeper into my thought process on how tanking in Guild Wars 2 PvE could be remastered to offer the possibility of such tanking, or just a more consistent aggro understanding. So, my three-pronged and possible ideal way to calculate tanking in Guild Wars 2 environments would firstly be the taunt condition and its duration. Second, the toughness stat. And third would be the vitality stat. Not the raw health number on the pool, but in your actual armor window where you can see your attribute, just in case there's an elementalist out there who wishes to dabble in the tanking playstyle and puts a 1900 vitality stat on their gear. After that, the aggroing mechanic on bosses and champion ranked mobs would start to devolve and crumble into more of a randomized selection of a randomized person within the highest bracket of toughness and vitality, while still focusing on taunt. By having taunt be the first and most influential factor, it would incentivize the use of more underused attribute combos with power, toughness, and expertise, or even ones with expertise as the main stat. It is entirely possible that power-focused players do not see a use for expertise, even though there are non-damaging conditions which are very strong and benefit from having expertise. Nevertheless, if tanking was more cohesive and consistently introduced into strike missions, raids, and fractal bosses, perhaps more variation would be considered. Taunt would still work in its original way of acting as an interrupt, while not actually interrupting your foe, but just shifting who they are targeting in PvE. With this change though, taunt would still function even if a break bar is present, be it locked or open. Taunt would still do minor break bar damage when a break bar is vulnerable, and would additionally benefit from the person with aggro dealing more damage to the break bar, but more on that in a bit. Now to quickly touch on which mobs would be affected by these changes, and the mobs I think would most benefit from it. First, I want to touch on open world. Basic to elite mobs, I believe these mobs would not need many changes, as they are almost always able to be influenced by taunt. Having some randomization factor in who they freely attack would be perfectly fine as well, as these are most often more squishy and easily killed, so they wouldn't have any other strict rules such as toughness and vitality checks, well, at least the ones that don't already have it implemented into their code. Now for champion mobs, these mobs are the most likely candidate to see such changes in aggro programming. I believe given the status of these mobs and how they often feel like bosses, a tanking system could be beneficial. So in most cases, I would vouch for champions to seek out who applied taunt, then who has the highest toughness, and then who has the highest vitality attribute. From there, it would of course break down and just go to a random player who's the highest in the bracket, just in case there are multiple people with the same toughness and vitality numbers. Taunt would still reign supreme though. Additionally, as these are often boss-like creatures, aggroing them would be slightly more dangerous, having champions do 5% more damage to their aggro target. But, in favor of the tank, perhaps tanks could find even more of a desirable role if they in turn did 10% more breakbar damage to the target, making tanks not only have the role of being in charge of positioning and managing defensive cooldowns, but also being the ones to excel, and a bit more passively, with managing breakbars, particularly in raid/fractal environments, but we'll get there soon. And as for open world legendaries and epic boss mobs, These two categories of monsters would probably not receive such changes, as they're highly specific mobs that are designed in a very specific way, having unique abilities, phases, and buffs. So these would just stay the same, and I don't think need much of a change in open world, considering there are already many players on a map at any given time. Now moving on to endgame PvE. All rules apply from the established basic to champion range, but now, legendary instance mobs would also join the group, able to be managed via taunt, toughness, and vitality. Now, I do think having some variation in situations such as raids and fractals is nice, so I could see a few bosses such as Matthias and Samurog keep their aggro mechanic, but by and large, I am under the impression that more consistency could be brought to this area of the game. One aspect I wish to highlight would be bosses deal 5% more damage to their aggro target, but tanks would find even more of a desirable role if they did 10% more breakbar damage to the target. I think having this would be very beneficial to allow for more single target healing applications that we see on the Spectre, and I think would wisely be implemented into other areas of support that already exist in the game. Not necessarily taking away AoE healing, but adding the option to provide more stronger single target heals, while in turn maybe shaving down a couple AoE heals, because AoE is extremely useful and oftentimes easier to apply. So that's my ramble overall of how I would adapt tanking to be more consistent in open world situations, particularly with champions in the open world. And then of course, any mobs in fractals and raid and strike environments. So now that I've discussed the possible method of tanking by utilizing what already exists in the game, just giving it a bit more consistency, I want to actually talk about class changes that I believe would be beneficial if tanking ever sees more of a spotlight in Guild Wars 2, as I desperately think it should. So let's talk about some extra abilities that could be revised to better slot into this tanking playstyle. So first and foremost, we have the Engineer Scrapper. Scrappers were always kind of said to be this bruisery tanking elite spec. And Quick Pin, I do believe that designing bruisers for elite specs is perfectly fine, but they don't see a lot of use in PvE environments. More so, they see them in PvP and World vs. World. If tanking was more consistent, maybe then bruisers would find a place in endgame content where they deal aggro management and they deal more breakbar damage. Nevertheless, Engineer Scrapper. A trait, Expert Examination. Stunning or dazing a foe applies taunt and weakness to them. Instead of vulnerability, I would just select this to be taunt, making the Scrapper do more dazing to apply such taunts. Maybe this would have a slight cooldown of 2 seconds. I didn't actually think about that. But I did alter some of these traits to have a PvP factor, because I do think adding too much taunt into PvP would not be healthy. So in the case of this, instead of taunt in PvP, this would still remain with vulnerability. Mass Momentum. Gain might while you have stability. Rocket Charge now applies taunt to a target on its final strike. So this would of course keep its might and stability, but add some taunt to the hammer. This allowing the Engineer and the Scrapper to now augment their weapon, just in case they are taking it for tanking. But for PvP, beginning the cast of Rocket Charge would instead give you stability instead of taunting at the final strike. Next, let's move into Guardian. Now, Guardian is one of my mains, and it's in the name, Guardian. I do think that if tanking was at least more consistently introduced into Guild Wars 2, Guardians could fill a really great role of tank. Not necessarily making Guardians the only ones that can tank. I have many other skill and trait ideas in this video, but I do love Guardians, so I might be a little bit biased here. First and foremost, Tenacious Defense. Aegis you grant reduces the recharge time of Virtue Skill 3 when it blocks an attack. Using Virtue Skill 3 with a target selected taunts them for a short duration. So this will keep its original function with Valor. Also, a lot of these ideas focus on Valor because it's kind of an underutilized trait line. Reduce recharge time by 1 second. It would taunt the target for 2 seconds. In competitive modes, it would instead slow them for half a second. Next, Courageous Heart. This is the trait for the hammer. Mighty Blow now taunts foes with an increased cooldown. Taunting a foe damages them. do a little bit of a duality, a little bit of a 3-second taunt. In PvP, this taunt I think would still be fine and would incentivize you to take this trait that I feel is somewhat underutilized. Also, chill doesn't really fit too well on Guardian, so maybe taunt or slow would be perfectly fine in a PvP environment, but damage on taunt would be a small pack at 150. For PvP, this would probably go down to like 50 or 20, something very minor. Increase cooldown by 8 seconds. Next, this is one of the biggest trait ideas, and really the first trait that I worked on for the idea of tanking being more consistent for Guardian. This is Stalwart Defender. Currently, this is a trait that only gives you 240 toughness if you're wielding a shield and reducing cooldowns, which is okay, but I feel like in the realm of 2021 could be slightly boring. And of course, again, if it was a bit more consistent, this could be a really awesome tanking trait to really solidify you into that role. So gain toughness baseline. Gain extra toughness when wielding a shield, and shield skills gain reduced recharge. Currently, there isn't this split feature of toughness. Additionally, Shield of Judgment and Shield of Absorption are augmented to allow for aggro management. These skills would receive changes if you take this. So now Shield of Judgment will only apply defensive boons to yourself. And now taunt a foe if you have a target selected. If you don't, it will just be a random single person that is hit with the cone of Shield of Judgment. So self-protection, self-aegis, taunt. In PvP, this would be just a little bit of a slow application, and number of targets would be going down to 3. Shield of Absorption, this was the heal and the bubble thing. I have reduced the radius. This no longer heals on detonate, but AoE taunts foes. So this would be a reduced radius of 240, meaning it's a bit more of a selfish defensive thing with melee foes and melee allies. The area taunt on detonation would be 3 seconds to 5 enemies. And in PvP, this would just be a 1 second slow on a bunch of enemies. And the detonate would no longer heal. So that's one of the biggest traits that I thought of. And then we're going to continue on more with Guardian, Strength of the Protector. Health degenerates more slowly while downed. I've increased this to 35%, just in case you are tanking and you do happen to go down, you'll have a little bit of a leeway. Taunting a foe extends the duration of select defensive boons on yourself. Self-protection, self-resolution, and self-aegis. Whenever you taunt a foe, you'll gain 1 second added to the duration of all 3 of those boons. So once again, a minor trait focusing on the tanking idea. Now we're finally moving away from Guardian and going into a little bit of Mesmer. So Mesmer, Phantasmal Defender. Summon an illusion that taunts your target. It's pretty much the same. However, now, upon an early shatter, aggro is shifted to you. I just wanted to highlight this skill because I think that this would be a really interesting Mesmer Chronomancer tanking skill. In PvP, the taunt would be to 1.5 seconds, while reducing the number of targets to 3 in every game mode. Next, Echo of Memory. Blocking incoming attacks for a short duration. If the skill fully channels, summon a phantasm that taunts your target, slows enemies, and grants protection to allies. If an attack is blocked, Deja Vu is usable for a short time. This would really solidify Chrono Tanks into that Chrono Tank idea under this fantasy realm of more consistent tanking. So the taunt would be 2 seconds, aggro shifted towards you upon a phantasm shatter, similar to the previous tooltip. In PvP, there would just be no taunt. It would stay the same. I think that'd be too powerful. So it'd be 2 seconds, protection 2 seconds, number of targets 3, radius 240, the range would be 900. Deja Vu would work exactly the same. So now we're going to talk about Ranger. Now for Ranger, I was also heavily inspired by the Untamed. As I have not played the Untamed, I still find it to be very lackluster. And once again, Bruiser specs, I think if they allowed more consistent tanking with taunt and toughness, Bruiser specs would find a lot of use in raiding and in strike missions, and even in fractals. So with that being said, we're gonna look at Ranger and the Untamed. Beastly Warden. Beast abilities taunt nearby foes. If your targeted enemy is struck with the beast ability, the taunt is extended. So this will still be an AoE taunt of 2 seconds, but if you have one specific target targeted, your pet, if it hits them, will target them for 4 seconds, double the duration, but this brings it down to 3 targets. Next, we're going into the Untamed. The Hammer. Overbearing Smash. Quickly strike the ground, dazing nearby enemies. If this strikes your target enemy, follow up with a leaping strike that taunts your target. So this will still keep its consistency. I know we haven't played this weapon yet at the time of recording, but just adding daze on top of daze is very worrisome. and a little leaving to be desired. So once again, going with that taunt idea, damage is 15% stronger on your second strike. In a PvE environment, this would taunt for 3 seconds, while in PvP, this would still continue to daze for 2 seconds, with the daze being half a second on its initial strike. Unleashed Overbearing Smash. This is when you are less tanky, but doing more damage. In turn, this would bolster some of your pet. Quickly strike the ground, blinding nearby enemies. If this strikes an enemy, your pet's next F1 skill will taunt the target and remove boons. So this is a damage, a blind, boons removed. 2, taunt for 3 seconds. In PvP, this would just apply weakness. Your pet's ability to weaken has a window of 10 seconds, and additionally, with the taunt as well, this effect would leave if your pet does not use an F1 ability within 10 seconds. Having a little bit more duality with the Unleashed mechanic as well, as when you are in your Unleashed phase, you're doing more damage, so this would allow your pet to take a little bit more aggro if you are able to masterfully weave those skills together. Next, Unnatural Traversal. Cantrip, teleport to your target, taunting them. A single target, while making nearby enemies vulnerable. If an enemy is struck, this skill's recharge is reduced. So this would also be a more guaranteed cantrip taunt. This would taunt for 4 seconds, applying 2 stacks of vulnerability. If you're in PvP or War vs. World, this would instead just add 1 extra stack, giving it 3 stacks of vulnerability for 6 seconds, with, of course, the similar ideas to the tooltip that we've already seen. Next, let's talk about Spellbreaker. Spellbreaker, once again, is another one of those elite specs that was designed to be a bit more bruisery, boon hate, some crowd control, and does see a lot of use in World vs. World and in PvP scenarios. But as for PvE, they really only fill that damage area, which Berserker highly did. If they were given maybe more taunt and the game allowed for a bit more of a consistent aggro mechanic, maybe then Spellbreakers could find its niche as a bruiser in PvE. So, Revenge Counter. This would be the ultimate, or the Grandmaster trait. Full counter deals additional damage, grants resistance, and taunts a target enemy. Copy conditions on yourself to targets you hit with full counter. This would increase the damage by 20, conditions copied 3. Resistance would be 3 seconds as well. In PvE, the taunt would last for 5 seconds, but if you're in PvP, instead of a taunt, it would just blind your target for 2 seconds. Next, we're going into core warrior abilities. Fear Me. Fear Me is a really interesting shout and probably is powerful, but I don't take it often. And I don't know if a lot of warriors do take it. I could be completely wrong, but I've decided to give it a little bit of a second pass. Fear Me. Induce fear in your foes. Fear duration increases based on the distance of your enemy. That stays the same. Having an enemy target selected will specifically taunt them. So this could work in a manner of a shout where you taunt a single foe, gaining their aggro, while also fearing any extra mobs or enemies that you do not want to focus on, or just better control. I have transferred the taunt mechanic over to the PvP area as well, as I think this would be a very strong bruiser mechanic to similar, and I almost put this function a little bit on Reaper as well, and I think Reaper could be deserving of some taunt, but this is what I've kind of come up with. Fear stays, weakness stays, adding a little bit of taunt to a specific enemy with a shorter range. Next up, warrior traits. Warrior Last Stand. This is in, I believe, your defense line, Grandmaster. Last Stand. Cast Lesser Balanced Stance when you are disabled. Balanced Stance now taunts if you have an enemy target selected. Stances gain increased duration. The taunt would be 5 seconds. In PvP, it would just apply slow. But I've decided to kind of fit this one into a bit more of a specific taunter to then gain control. Next, Shield Master. Reflect missiles whenever you are blocking. Using Shield Bash now taunts your target. Shield Bash would then kind of fit a bit more of a consistent taunting mechanic in PvE, while in PvP, it would just apply some slow. Shield skills gain reduced recharge. That is completely the same. So that's kind of my roundup of abilities, a little bit of a selection, a little bit of a sampling of how they could go back and add a couple extra taunt conditions in PvE, considering in PvE, taunt is not as powerful as it is in PvP, because, you know, maybe they would have to look back and see to make sure that taunt doesn't do insane amounts of breakbar damage, it doesn't do insane amounts of interrupts, it just simply shifts the aggro. And then even in raiding scenarios, maybe you could have it to where bosses are hard-coded to where if one of your allies taunts the boss, There's an internal cooldown of 2 to 3 seconds before the boss will then shift its aggro to the next player that taunts them. So there's a couple of areas of more details that would maybe have to be thought about for coding in terms of endgame content scenarios. But overall, I think having more consistency with taunt being a very good normalized taunting condition as in any other MMORPG would bring more consistency. And then perhaps going back to raid bosses and fractals and strikes, and even for future design, having it to where taunt takes precedent, and then more consistently bosses look at toughness, and then they look at vitality. Because I think that because the encounters vary so much with this specific area, people who like to tank and get comfortable and good at tanking, they are not always able to utilize their skills. Well, if you're a healer, you almost always can. If you're a damage dealer, you almost always can. But I think tanking really has not seen a lot of that love. So this was a sampling of abilities, going over possible ways to augment and better define what tanking means in Guild Wars 2. So thank you everyone so much for coming. Comment below your thoughts if you would like to see maybe more consistency brought into Guild Wars 2 endgame scenarios. Would you like to go in this direction where taunt is better utilized and not just kind of a throwaway condition? So yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts. Like if you liked it, comment down below, and subscribe for more videos. Patreon is down below if you'd like to help support, and also if you'd like to pre-order End of Dragons, I have links down below. Thank you everyone for coming, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Bye everyone. Mwah!